Hello, I'm Richard Corns, Chief Executive of the British Council for Offices, the BCO, and welcome to this new normal special. Now, those who are familiar with the series will know that each week I talk to a prominent member of the BCO about the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on the office sector. But these special interviews are a bit different. They're designed to complement that regular series and look outside our world. In the first of these, we focused on politics, and I had a chat with Sir Craig Oliver, David Cameron's former communications chief. That's still available on the BCO's website for anyone who would like to see it. Now, this time we focus on business, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome Martin Vander Weyer as my guest. So welcome, Martin.
Hello, good morning, Richard.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Martin, and thank you for sparing some time. For those who may not know, Martin is business editor of the Spectator and a regular contributor to the Daily Telegraph, the Literary Review, and other national publications. Before turning to journalism, Martin was an investment banker in London, Brussels, and the Far East. But more important than all of that is his participation at previous BCO annual conferences, most recently in 2016 in Amsterdam, just before the Brexit referendum, where he sparred with Guy Verhofstadt. So welcome again, Martin. We'll go straight to questions, if I may. And the first theme I'd like to touch upon is what we might call the recovery. Now, we're clearly heading for a very severe recession, but there will be a recovery at some point. So how long do you think it will take to get there, and what might that recovery look like when we do get
there? Thank you, Richard, and thank you for reminding me of that very happy trip to Amsterdam in 2016 and that rather extraordinary panel session with Guy Verhofstadt, who you might remember I claimed as a distant cousin because my surname is Flemish, much to his irritation, and the excellent Steve Richards representing the Remainer view rather strongly, as I recall. So yes, okay, recovery. Frankly, most forecasts aren't worth, the space they occupy, the paper they're written on at this moment. We really don't know how bad this is going to be or how quickly we can come out of it. I think by nature, I'm generally an optimist. I've seen many people writing about, will this be a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery? U-shape means we, stay at the bottom of it for longer and then come out of it steeper. I suppose V-shape means we just bounce back, and we have seen some V-shaped recoveries from past shocks, but they're mostly financial shocks. They're not like this one. So what do I think? I think a great number of businesses will be able to go back to business, not at full scale, but at levels that enable them to tick over again relatively quickly. I think we can rely on the private sector to be ingenious and creative in making working methods that can cope with the circumstances and so on. So if we set aside aviation, tourism, hospitality, and so on, all of which are going to be absolutely flattened by this. You cannot see any real light at the end of the tunnel for them at this moment. If you can somehow set that part of the economy aside, the rest of the economy, I think we will be seeing some recovery by the spring of next year, let's say, and certainly a return to sort of recognizable levels of activity in the last quarter of this year. But who can say, really? Who can say? Everyone who's asked to comment on anything covers themselves with lots of conditional clauses, like when there's a vaccine or when there's test and tracing in place and so on. but we have seen things move on extraordinarily rapidly. And I think the way in which not just the NHS, but the whole public sector has reacted and moved fast on the biggest projects in this are encouraging. So, it will all look different by the autumn, and I think it will look somewhat better, quite a lot better by the spring. But my heart bleeds for the aviation, tourism, and hospitality industries, who are really, in deep trouble because of this.
It's often been said that economists are very good at explaining what's happened in the past, but very challenged by forecasting what might happen in the future. And I think it's easy to see why, and this is particularly problematic because so much of it is new. And I'm going to come back to some of those points, if I may, Martin, a bit later. But I'd like to move on now to Brexit, which was, of course, the big subject we obsessed about for 3.5 years. And you mentioned the panel that we had with Steve and Kiva Hofstad in Amsterdam in 2016. But we now have left the European Union. That is a fact. We've gone. But the transitional arrangements, the discussions are supposedly in play, and that expires at the end of the year. So do you think, Martin, we will secure a deal in the time that is left? And if not, in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, does it really matter that much?
It matters because it would clearly be better if we secured a deal. And if you think in terms of, for example, the automotive industry trying to restart, I mean, if they haven't got seamless movement of components back and forth between the UK and Europe beyond the end of this year, then any attempt to restart the current system of car building, which relies very heavily on that, is absolutely jinxed. So yes, it's very, very important. It's important for the City of London. It's important for all sorts of sectors that trade is as well oiled, well lubricated as it can be as this recovery begins. Now, there's a lot of coverage bubbling up now about the Brexit talks, about Mr. Frost and Mr. Barnier being in a standoff again, and it's not looking good at the moment. I think the only hopeful thing you can say is we have sort of been here before, and every time we've been here before, they have concocted some deal at the last moment, and that is the nature of EU negotiations and the foolishness of falling off the end of this into no deal after all of this. And I mean all of the past history of the Brexit negotiation, plus all of the additional huge problems created by the pandemic, the irresponsibility that would represent on both sides of allowing this to end in a no deal stalemate would be absurd. So I suspect we'll get a deal. It's stuck on several points at the moment. Fisheries is one of them. Fascinating, really, because it's such a small part of the UK economy, but it's such a big issue, and the fact that fisheries issues could block agreement on a whole range of other much bigger sectors of economic life is an absurdity. But that's where we are now, and I think. From the position that we've got to, we have left the EU in a formal sense. We clearly wish to be an independent trading nation, an independent coastal nation is the phrase in relation to fisheries. So the public sympathy at the moment probably would be quite strongly with the government and Mr. Frost. But as I say, we cannot have a situation where we fall off a cliff at the end of the year. That would be a disaster.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, Martin. I very much hope you're right. I mean, I suspect, it's maybe conjecture, but I suspect, there is this sort of core group of what you might call Brexit ultras in the Tory party who will be quite content if we walked away without a deal. But I hope common sense will prevail. And David Davis was interesting earlier this week on the Stowe programme, I think it was, when he was saying, rightly so, that so often with these negotiations, it goes to the wire. It goes pretty much to the very end, and that's the sort of traditional culture within the EU. Let's jump, if I may, to what we might call change of business as a sort of broad theme, and it comes back to some of the points you were raising in the first question, Martin. But clearly, and very sadly, some businesses will not recover from this crisis, and we're seeing that already in retail and casual dining. Café Rouge being an example earlier this week of a business that's gone under. So where do you think the opportunities will come from for future growth, new business and new jobs?
I think what we're seeing in this very early phase of this, what we might say, gale of creative destruction, that's the Schumpeter phrase, isn't it? Is businesses in weak sectors and weak businesses within weak sectors are the first to go. So we all knew that casual dining as a sector was in huge trouble, and that lots of those chains, heavily sort of financed by debt, backed by private equity and so on, concepts that weren't really loved by the consumers, that they would be first to go. Likewise, some of the retailers that were already at risk are going. I think that's no surprise at all. The next phase, I think, will be businesses that simply don't have the cash, even with the government support schemes, to see this through, even though they may fundamentally have good products and good businesses and so on. So cash will take out another wave. What will grow out of the rubble? Well, gosh, that'll be fascinating to see. Digital businesses and e-commerce, generally logistics businesses, data analysis businesses, a whole lot of stuff in the new economy rather than the old economy has enormous potential to come through to a new level out of a crisis like this, I think. And with one of my hats on, running the Spectator, what we now call Economic Innovator of the Year awards. We did call them Disruptor, but we thought, well, we've just met the disruptor of all time in the coronavirus, so we'll call this Innovator instead. Anyway, every single one of the entrants for that were previous winners or thinking of entering this year and so on that I talked to, they're all busy, they're all working from home, they're all looking towards ramping up in the autumn. They're all pivoting their business in one way or another to do something related to the hunt for a vaccine or the data the government needs and so on. So I think you'll see entrepreneurial, 1,000 points of entrepreneurial light, as it were, and a lot of it will be in the digital space.
I'm sure you're right, Martin. And the first year when you ran that competition, I mean, I was astonished by the range and breadth of ideas that had come forward, and some amazing talent out there. And let's hope it really comes to the fore as we move out of the crisis. I'd like to move now to cost. And we've touched on a bit of this, but the sums being borrowed by the government are truly eye-watering. I mean, it's staggering. We've seen nothing like this in peacetime. Interest rates are obviously at a historic low, but surely taxes will have to increase at some point. Or does the magic money tree, as Theresa May once put it, really exist?
Yes. What's different in this era from previous eras is that, first of all, the magic money tree, can operate to a certain extent that is quite surprising. That is to say, quantitative easing, when it was introduced, money printing, as a resort after the 2008 financial crisis, all wise heads said, "Ooh, that'll be very inflationary." It turned out not to be very inflationary, because it wasn't very inflationary in itself, but B, because there were deflationary pressures in the economy, um, largely to do with advances of technology, to which are added now this crash of oil prices. So there's both the tech effect and the energy cost effect that are deflationary, which would counter the inflationary effect of a lot of money printing. So that is a possibility. Secondly, with these ultra low interest rates, which really show no sign of going upwards again, and central banks have almost lost the use of that tool, really, of interest rates. There seems to be no prospect of interest rates returning to previously familiar levels. That does make it rather cheap to borrow. And so I have heard economists saying, well, yes, a huge, unprecedented, at least since the Second World War, increase in borrowing one-off to pay for the furlough scheme and all the other things that are going on right now, and then park that as a huge addition to the national debt, but with a relatively small interest cost, and over a generation or so, and with inflation even at normal levels of inflation, it will sort of erode away, and it won't wholly distort the economy. So that's an optimistic view of all that. Yes, I agree. It would seem perfectly natural to put some taxes up at some point, but not immediately, because you really don't want to deter recovery as it begins to take off. You certainly don't want to deter entrepreneurs, wealth creators, people who are going to drive the restoration of employment from a sudden drop. So I think tax rises are some distance away, but they must be coming. And I'm curious as to whether across the world there'll be a move towards wealth tax, for example. I'm certain there'll be a stronger move led by the OECD and perhaps the G20 to coordinate corporate tax rates, because some of the big winners from this, you can immediately think of Amazon up front on this one, doing absolutely huge volumes of business through this crisis and paying astonishingly low rates of tax around the world, and numerous other giants of the digital world. And so I think, the world's tax authorities will be pursuing corporate taxes avidly, more so than before, and with greater coordination. Personal taxes will come later, and we may see a wave of wealth taxes across the world that will please that famous economist, Monsieur Piketty of France, who wants to see that happen.
I suspect you're right, Martin. I think the government will be very, very wary of choking off the recovery as and when it comes. I think there will be one thing is certain: there's going to be no return to austerity. That ship has long sailed. But yes, I could see some taxes going on assets and wealth, but they'll be reluctant, I think, to tax income. But looking at the big corporates, those who've benefited, that this might be the opportunity to tackle that once and for all. Now, I'm conscious of time, but I've got a couple more I'd like to get to. My penultimate question, Martin, is on what we might call relaying the message. Now, you know the Prime Minister very well, Martin, of course, because Boris is a journalist by trade, which is perhaps forgotten by some at the moment. He's one of your former editors at the Spectator. But how well do you think the PM and the government, perhaps more generally, has done in working with business in terms of relaying the message during this crisis?
It's true. I did know Boris very well when he was a journalist. I sat alongside him both at the Spectator and at the Telegraph. And I must say, when he gave his Sunday evening broadcast 10 days or so ago, I recognized there the Boris of old, the Boris who was kind of about to miss his deadline for his Telegraph column or for the Spectator going to print, and he knew he had to say something at 7 o'clock, and he just blundered through it, and then his entourage had to tidy it up afterwards for him. That was very Boris, and that was perhaps his lowest moment in this. In many other ways, I think we should acknowledge that Boris is a fine communicator. He's unmatched in British politics for his rhetoric, his vocabulary, the energy that he can put into making a set piece speech. And so I don't want to condemn Boris for his performance, especially as he's been so ill in the middle of it. What I think is that in the early stages, I mean, Rishi Sunak, who I like and admire personally very much, I thought he was terrific in his first appearance when he said, we're going to do whatever it takes. We're going to do this furlough scheme. We're going to put up, business support loans and so on. And that was reassuring at the moment it was needed. It was pretty clear, and the government systems, and I experienced them because I have a hand in a small social enterprise. It's our local arts centre, and we applied for the grant, the £10,000 grant. We have furloughed our staff. It all worked extremely efficiently, and a lot of businesses could take reassurance from that. Then we heard, the banks are being slow processing the loans and all that. So the banks got a kicking and they speeded up. And I think on the whole, given that it's unprecedented, it's enormously expensive, I don't know whether they had these things on the shelf in case of a disaster, but when they produced these schemes, they made them work as quickly as the government itself could possibly make a large-scale new scheme work. So I think in the early phases, I would give them many positive marks in relation to the way they've dealt with business. And that's, I wouldn't necessarily say the same about some of the things that we're now learning about testing, about PPE, all of that stuff in the health and care sector. There are clearly questions to answer, but I think as a response to the economic shock, they were pretty good, actually.
I agree absolutely, Martin. I mean, it's extraordinarily difficult hand to have to deal with that came at breathtaking speed, and I think the quality of the response has generally been very high, with a few less good points, of course. And I think one thing I found astonishing about Boris's statement on that Sunday evening, where the easing of the lockdown, was I don't know whether this is true or not, but I heard that no other member of the cabinet had seen that before it was broadcast, which I find absolutely breathtaking, because I don't think that such a talented individual as Boris will look back on that as being one of the sort of highlights in his sort of communications efforts. But there we are. We're going to move on to the last question, if I may, Martin, because we are pretty much out of time. But I'd just like to gaze into the future, what we might call crystal balls, and I hope not just balls, but let's call it crystal balls. And this is all conjecture and speculation. But do you think when we look back on this crisis will be seen as a flash in the pan, or is this going to be a lasting moment in history with profound consequences?
I think not a flash in the pan, and I think let's not develop this theme right now. I'll try and answer the second part of the question, but I think that there will be an enormous residual fear, even if we have a vaccine for this virus, that pandemic viruses are a new thing in the world. And as a result of globalization, the speed at which a virus can spread around the world is just phenomenal and terrifying. So the world will adjust, will change its rules of engagement for fear of future pandemics. So that will be a permanent change. I certainly don't think a flash in the pan. I think this is a big trauma, and it will linger with us for a very long time. Interesting historical point is we've heard a lot in the last 2 or 3 months about the Spanish flu of 1918-19, but oddly enough, that was a forgotten episode. I mean, not many school children learned about that. I never did. I knew nothing at all about it, but that was a gigantic epidemic that killed many, many, many millions of people, and it was kind of forgotten in the 1920s and afterwards. So yeah, the way history is told and remembered it follows curious patterns. But so what I'm interested to see is there was a lot of talk in the business world before this about a shift to a new tone of business, about, purpose before profit. It was focused very much on climate change. I think it will now focus very much on employee welfare issues and the value we place on health and care workers. The relative values of different categories of work will change because of the praise for dependence on the health and care sector that will go on for months and months from now. I think, conspicuous displays of enjoyment of great wealth will not be a popular thing in the coming year or two, because there will be many people unemployed, and the elite, the privileged, the people who are seen to have come through this rather painlessly, would be best advised not to do too much showing off, if you see what I mean. So I think there will be a different tone of public life. I think the sense of national unity will fall apart a bit. I mean, the politicians will start ripping into each other with more vigor as soon as they possibly can. But I think there will be a different tone, and it will last for several years.
Very interesting, Martin. I mean, there are all kinds of things that have come out of this in such a short space of time. That sort of the community spirit, the caring society, I mean, that is, very, very profound. But also something that I think, Boris has said earlier this week that I find interesting, that where he found it remarkably easy to sort of turn the switch and lock people down, to take away their liberty, but actually persuading them to take it back again, even in small doses, is going to be a lot more challenging for all kinds of.
Yeah, and you talked about getting the message across. I mean, crowd psychology, mass psychology, a whole field of science coming into its own right now, and you hope that besides all the epidemiologists surrounding Boris, he's got another room full of crowd psychologists trying to work out how on earth to nudge the public back towards normality, and also trying to head off a sort of, deeply buried British urge towards reliance on the state, which we had moved a long way away from. But now people are saying, whoa, the government must tell me exactly, how many centimeters must I stand from my, my partner, my neighbor, and so on. All this, what I hope is actually one thing that may come out of this is that the private sector, big businesses and small, have been helpful, ingenious, inventive, innovative, have come up with lots of solutions. Obviously, big drug companies are the ones we want to come up with the big solutions, but many other businesses will have played a really useful part in A, getting us through this deep crisis, and B, building a recovery, so that there won't be a general turning against capitalism, business generally, and turning back towards reliance on the state, because that would take us back to a Britain of, many decades ago that I think we really don't want to go back to. I
could not agree more, Martin. We could carry on talking for a lot longer, as always, but sadly we are out of time. It's been an enormous pleasure to chat to you, Martin. I'm extremely grateful to you for spending some time with me and the BCO. I hope you've all enjoyed this second special interview.
Can I just send one last message, which is...
Of course you can, Martin.
I must say I've enjoyed numerous contacts with BCO and BCO members, especially at your big conferences, and especially with you personally, Richard. So from me and from the Spectator, I hope some of you are Spectator readers, greetings to you all, and I hope your businesses stay strong, and thank you for inviting me to do this.
Well, thank you, Martin. No, it's great to have you as a friend of the BCO, and personally, it's been fascinating, as always. For anyone who doesn't read the Spectator, go and read it. It is the best weekly read you can find. Martin, I'm very grateful, as always. Thank you very much for your time. And from Martin and from me, thank you very much, and goodbye.